as our text, we'll read 1 Corinthians 10. And we'll head back to Numbers 11. We'll begin reading in verse number 1. Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant, how that all our fathers were passed under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. With many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things were our examples, to the intent we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. And tonight we're going to be looking at the subject, graves of lusts, graves of lust. And what I believe this is referring to in particular is an event we find in Numbers 11:34. This is the end of it, of the story. And he called the name of that place Kibroth Hattaavah, because they buried the people that lusted. And that's the end of the story there. And tonight, Lord willing, we'll look a little bit of why they buried that place and why they buried them in their graves of lust. One reason that God tells us we need to know the Old Testament stories is so that we won't lust after evil things. And that's why I read 1 Corinthians 10, because the children of Israel and their journey to the Promised Land, their history was given to us as an example. That God ordained that these events happen for many purposes, but one of them is that whenever you and I tonight consider this, that we will learn from that, and as a negative example, we can learn what the consequences are of lust. And we won't lust after evil things. And the book of Numbers is full of the examples of men and women who lusted for evil and despised the good. Well, in our day, lust, the word lust has narrowed to only one connotation. So you say lust, or I say lust, you probably think a sexual sin or fornication. But the fact is that the word means to desire, or to long for, or to covet. And that word that's translated lust in 1 Corinthians is also translated desiring and covet in another context. So it does not strictly mean fornication, but it is any desiring of something in this evil context that they were desiring, they were longing for, they were coveting after evil things. So they had a desire in their heart to long for that which is forbidden. So tonight, we want to think about this graveyard that they had there, and they built it all because the people lusted. All because the people desired something that was forbidden. I wonder if you walk through a graveyard and look at the tombstones, I wonder how many people are there because of lust, because of evil that has come upon people. How many could you walk through and see that maybe a man was shot in the act of robbing a bank or whatever it may be. Well, here this graveyard was full of people there buried because of their sin. Well, Israel, whenever they're coming out of Egypt to the Promised Land, over and over again they were complaining about their condition. They murmured against God. The chapter begins, in fact, with people complaining. And God sent fire to destroy a portion of the people. Even today when people talk about, that somebody's telling a lie, I hear this a lot, that people will look up to the sky and step out and say, I'm going to get out of here before lightning strikes me. And the idea is that if you sin in such a way that God will send fire from heaven and devour you. Well, God did do that to Israel here. He actually did send fire from heaven to devour the people. Verse number 1 in chapter 11, when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, and the Lord heard it, and his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burnt among them and consumed them that were in the uttermost parts of the camp. Now, it doesn't really say why they were complaining or what they were complaining about. But John Gill says that they had only traveled about 8 miles. So they were 8 miles into their trip. And this is not that they had been in the wilderness for months and months and months, and they'd been wandering for miles, and they were just exhausted. They were 8 miles. We wouldn't even be in Brunswick if we took off. That's how short a time period they were going, and they already started complaining. And God sends fire down to consume them. So, did that stop the complaining? Do you think that stopped whatever it is they were murmuring about? No, in fact, it just continued on. It didn't even slow them down. Because in verse number 2, and the people cried unto Moses, when Moses prayed unto them, that the Lord the fire was quenched, and he called the name of the place a Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burnt among them. And the mixed multitude that was among them fell a-lusting. And the children of Israel also wept again, and said, Who shall give us flesh to eat? So, I don't know how long it is, but it seems like the smoke was still rising from the earth. And they went a-lusting, they went complaining again. That God had sent the fire from heaven to consume the complainers, and then they start complaining again. And this shows you the blindness of the sinful man. The blindness of one who was wrapped up and caught up in sin. And really, Martin Lloyd-Jones used to speak of the stupidity of sin, the illogic nature of sinfulness, that a person will do what is killing him and do what is going to destroy him, and do it and love doing it. Knowing, and Romans chapter 1 speaks of this, that they do the evil things and they know that it's wicked and they know that they're going to be destroyed for it, and they do it and enjoy doing it. This is what Israel did. God sent fire to destroy some that complained, and those who were alive and remained complained unto God. They wanted flesh to eat. They were lusting after the food of Egypt. If you look at verse number 5, we remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt freely, and the cucumbers, and the melons, and the leeks, and the onions, and the garlic. They were not satisfied with what God had given them. They were looking at what was good in Egypt. They said, boy, we think about that fresh fish that we had, and those onions, and the garlic. Oh, they're just talking about how delicious that was, and how good that was. And I haven't eaten supper yet, and my mouth started watering when I was talking about it. But maybe that's how they felt. They were hungry, and they said, we're tired of this manna. We're tired of what God has given us. We want what we had back in Egypt. We want what we had back while we were slaves. We want what we had back while we were under the bondage of Pharaoh. We want what we had where they would whip us and beat us and murder us. That's what we want. We want those good things that we had where they took our baby boys out of our hands and threw them in the river. You think they really wanted that? I don't think that they could, but I just think this is the blindness of sin. That they were looking back, and they weren't thinking about how cruel Pharaoh was. They weren't thinking about their bondage. They weren't thinking about Pharaoh murdering their children. They were thinking about cucumbers and melons and onions and fish. And boy, God's just not very good to us. God's not very good to us. And that's their first danger, is they are saying that God is not good. That God isn't good. And we all can do that. Every one of us could do that. We all could complain about how we don't have it like we used to, or how we don't have it like we want to have it now, and miss the blessings of how God is blessing us. We just read a whole lot of names on the prayer list of people dying, facing death, in financial ruin, all kinds of situations that we read about. And thank God that you have the blessings of health that you have tonight. And thank God for the blessings of of the financial means that you may have, or whatever the case is. You know, we can always find ways to complain and to murmur and to grumble, but that's not a heart of thanksgiving. You just stop and think about how God has blessed you and how God has kept you, either physically or spiritually, financially. We've come into this air conditioning building tonight, and we'll go to our homes on the way tonight after the service. I don't know that anybody's starving to death or anything like that. God's good to us. God is good to us. And God was good to Israel. God had blessed them and said, I'm taking you away. We're going to walk. I'm taking you out of bondage. We're going to go across the desert, and there's a land flowing with milk and honey. Just eat this manna for a little while, this supernatural food that'll just fall out of the sky for you. You eat this for a little while, then you enter into the rest that you have there in Canaan. But they were not satisfied with God's goodness. And they had no reason to complain. But in verse number 8 it says, and the people went about and gathered manna, and ground it in mills, or beat it in a mortar, and baked it in pans, and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was the taste of fresh oil. So it wasn't like it tasted bad. It wasn't that it tasted bad, and it wasn't that they couldn't fix it in any different way or anything like that. It was good. The people just didn't want it anymore. They didn't want what God had given them. And that's a discontentment. That God was blessing them, but they didn't want what God gave them. They wanted something else because they thought God was holding back on them. And does any of this sound familiar to you? Does it remind you of the Garden of Eden? Does it remind you of Eve there and the serpent whispering to her, you know, God's not giving you the best. God is holding back what is good for you. And then as Eve had everything that she could want, the only thing that she could concentrate on was that one thing that God told her no. And then she said, well, God's not good to me because God's holding back. And that's what they were thinking. Well, God's not good to me because God isn't giving me what I want right at this very moment. And what I want right now is some meat. I don't want to eat this manna stuff. I want meat. I want what I used to have. I want the goodness of Pharaoh and what Pharaoh gave us instead of the goodness of God. Well, that was Pharaoh wasn't good to them, was he? Pharaoh was terrible to them, but they were acting like Pharaoh was better to them than God was. Well, Moses gets fed up with it. And Moses is at the end of his rope and calls them a bunch of babies. In verse number 10, and Moses said unto the Lord, wherefore hast thou afflicted thy servant? And wherefore have I found favor in thy sight, that thou layest the burden of all this people upon me? Have I conceived all this people, that I have begotten them, that thou shouldst say unto me, carry them in thy bosom as a nursing father beareth the suckling child, unto the land which thou swearest unto their fathers? I said, Lord, I've had all I can have. These people are a bunch of babies, and I have to carry them around like a bunch of nursing babies. And they want, they just cry and complain and whine and murmur. When should I have flesh to give unto these people? For they weep unto me, saying, give us flesh that we may eat. So Moses is praying to God and said, where am I going to get flesh? They come to me and say, Moses, give us flesh. Moses, give us flesh. And Moses, probably as he hears this, looks around into the vastness of the desert and the wilderness and probably thinks, where in the world am I going to get flesh? What do you want me to do about it? And he's pouring his heart out unto God. He said, I'm not able to bear this people alone because it's too heavy for me. And if thou deal thus with me, kill me, I pray thee, out of hand, if I have found favor in thy sight, and let me not see my wretchedness. So now Moses starts to whine a little bit here, and he said, just kill me. Just kill me. I'd rather die than have to listen to their complaining anymore. Well, God heard the prayer of Moses, and God didn't kill Moses, but God did hear the complaining of Israel. And God knew the lusting of the hearts of the people, that they lusted after what God hadn't given them. And that's the way with sin. That's the way with sin, that they won't take, a sinner won't take what God gives him and be happy with it. but he wants what is forbidden, and can only be happy if he can have what's forbidden. Take a man who commits adultery. There he is, and he has a wife that God has given him, but the wife isn't good for him. Marriage is good, and he has a wife, and the marriage bed, which is undefiled, but that's not good. He desires what God hasn't given him, so he covets and longs for something that God hasn't given him. A man has a house, but he desires a bigger house. He desires a house that God hasn't given him. So he lusts and covets and desires and thinks that God's holding out on him because he hasn't given him the blessing that he thinks he deserves. So this covetousness and lusting rejects the goodness of God. Look there in verse number 18. And say thou unto the people, sanctify yourselves against tomorrow, and ye shall eat flesh, for you have wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, who shall give us flesh to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt, therefore the Lord will give you flesh, and you shall eat. Ye shall not eat 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, neither 10 days, nor 20 days, but even a whole month, until it come out of your nostrils, and it be loathsome unto you, because you have despised the Lord, which is among you, and have wept before him, saying, why I came forth out of Egypt. So here we have some pretty plain speech with Moses praying to God, and some pretty plain speech from God. So you want meat? All right, you'll have meat. You'll have it, and you'll have so much of it, it'll come out your nose. You'll have so much of it that you won't want it anymore. So later on, God sends a wind, and a great number of quail come flying real close to the ground so the people can just go out and catch them. Not a few birds to eat, not just 1 or 2 birds to eat, but more birds than you could probably imagine. It's probably a terrifying sight at first that these quails were just coming from wherever, and just multitudes and multitudes, millions of quails. Look in verse number 32. It says, and the people stood up all that day, and all that night, and all the next day, and they gathered the quails. He that gathered the least gathered 10 homers, and they spread them all abroad for themselves round about the camp. So they didn't just go out and grab 1 or 2. No, God gave them enough manna for that day. He provided what they needed for that one day, but they didn't want the manna. So here come these quails, and they didn't just go grab 1 or 2. They stood up all day, and then they stayed up all that night. And then all the next day, gathering these quails. And they gathered, and they gathered, and they gathered. You say, well, how much is 10 homers? I don't know what that means. Well, Unger's Bible Dictionary says that a homer was originally a donkey load. That's what they would call it. So however much that is. And then he says it consisted of nearly 8 bushels. Nearly 8 bushels. I know a lot about bushels. That's how we measured the apples. So the least person that went out and gathered quails had 80 bushels of quail. 80 bushels of quail. That's the least that they had. The last year that I picked apples on my dad's farm, they paid 75 cents a bushel. And the average was about 100 bushels in an 8-hour day. So that was what the average person could pick in 8 hours, is about 100 bushels. If you were really going at it, you could get it in less time than that. But that's about what the average was, is 100 bushels. So the apples were in a bushel crate. And last year I picked, but after I quit picking apples, I drove the tractor, and I'd go and pick them up and put them on the tractor in the wagon. And the wagon would hold about 80 bushels of apples. So there's a lot of weight and a lot of space to pick up all those bushels of apples. So you have maybe a 25-foot tree, you might have 15 or 20 bushels of apples on it. So one big apple tree would have maybe 15, 20 bushels. So you think of maybe a wagon probably from here to the back door there, maybe 10, 15 foot wide, would hold about that many bushels of apples. Now, when you think about how much that is, 80 bushels, well, we're not talking about the really greedy one, we're talking about the person that got the least. had 80 bushels of quails. The least gathered that many. Now picture these people feverishly picking up these quails and the great quantity that they had. So if they had 100 bushels of quail and they laid them side by side, you'd probably fill up this room, probably out into the foyer, or maybe all the way out to the door. That's a lot of quails to pick up. And I wonder what they were going to do with all these quails. What were they going to do with all those? They weren't going to eat them that night. You imagine that. All these people out there, all these Israelites with quails just everywhere, just greedily grabbing. It's like the people you see on TV on the day after Thanksgiving sales. And they open the door and everybody just trampling over top of each other, just grabbing stuff and throwing it in the cart. I don't even think they know what they're grabbing. They just, it's on sale, so they have to get it. They'll grab and fight. That's how I imagined this at first. They just knocking people over and grabbing, just greedy, having to have it. They lusted after this food, and their lust drove them to this type of greedy behavior. And we all know that that's wrong. And we all know that that's a terrible attitude to have. But at the same time, we all know, if we're honest with ourselves, we have that same spirit about us sometimes when we desire what God hasn't given to us. I don't know what they were going to do with all those quails. Think about how much salt it would have taken to cure all that meat. And how are you going to transport it anyway? Let's say they did take it and they did have some way to preserve it. What are they going to do with all the meat? They're walking to Canaan land. They didn't have houses to live in and barns to put it in. What were they going to do with it? It took a big tractor and a 20-foot wagon to get 100 bushels of apples. What were they going to do with all that quail? Well, they started eating. They got what they wanted. They lusted after food. They stingily got as much as they could get their greedy little hands on. And they feasted. They ate and ate and ate. And the Bible tells us as the food was still in their mouth, they were still chewing on that quail, God smote the people with a plague. This is described in Psalm 78. And we'll listen to how the psalmist describes what happened. Psalm 78, verse 17. And they sinned yet more against him by provoking the Most High in the wilderness. And they tempted God in their heart by asking meat for their lust. Yea, they spake against God and said, Can God furnish a table in the wilderness? So they doubted God's goodness, and they lusted after it. They spoke against God. And in verse 22, because they believed not in God and trusted not in his salvation, though he had commanded the clouds from above and opened the doors of heaven, and rained down manna upon them to eat, and had given them the corn of heaven, man did eat angels' food. He sent them meat to the full. He caused an east wind to blow in heaven, and by his power he brought the south wind. He rained flesh also upon them, as dust, and feathered fowls, like as the sand of the sea. And he let it fall in the midst of their camp round about their habitations, so they did eat, and were well filled, for he gave them their own desire. They were not estranged from their lust, but while their meat was yet in their mouths, the wrath of God came upon them, and slew the fattest of them, and smote down the choice men of Israel. For all this they sinned still, and still believed not for his wondrous works. God often judges a people like this by giving them over to what they want, and what they want destroys them. Proverbs 1, well, a lot of the Proverbs speak of this same principle, that the wicked man sets his own trap. The sinner will set his own trap and his own destruction. His own sin, what he desires most, will end up ensnaring him and entrapping him. And this is what God gave him. He said, if you want to lust, if you want to have all this, you can have it. I'll give it to you. And that was their judgment. That was their destruction. God gave them over to their lust, and their lust killed them. And they were buried in their graves of lust. And that's what we read there in our text, that they buried them in those graves because they lusted. Well, the wages of sin is death, and sin has consequences, and lust is destructive. And we have to kill lust before lust kills us. And we could consider many ways that lust could destroy you. You could bury your marriage in a grave of lust. You could bury your marriage there. They were buried because of their lust, but you could bury your marriage in lust. Adultery leads to destroying your marriage. The strange woman in Proverbs 5 describes this, that I think all men should read and study Proverbs 5. And boys, before they get married, they should read this, because the wages of adultery will destroy it by lust. You can bury your marriage. You can bury your friends and your family in graves of lust. Families are ruined by men and women following their lust, and fortunes are lost in greedy covetousness. Divorces hurt children. Fathers bury their sons and the children in graves of lust in the pursuit of riches. Mothers and fathers can lose their family by focusing upon covetousness instead of being godly in their respective roles. You can bury your testimony in a grave of lust. Proverbs tells us a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than the sin and gold. A good name is better than being a millionaire. It's better than riches. And somebody can bury their testimony in graves of lust for a few moments of fleeting pleasure or lusting after what is unlawful. You can bury your testimony and your godly witness in a grave of lust. You can bury your happiness in graves of lust, your peace and your joy in the Spirit. If you start grieving the Holy Spirit, you'll lose your joy. And if you live a life of covetousness and lustfulness, you can lose your joy and your peace and your happiness in this life. But thankfully, we can bury our lusts and not be buried by them. James 1:12 says, "Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised them that love him." So you can be buried by them, but if you are indwelt by the Holy Spirit of God, you can mortify those lusts, and you can put the lust to grave. And instead of you being buried by your lust, you, by the Spirit's power, can bury your lust by mortifying this sin. That God gives us the ability to endure temptation, or to persevere, to hold fast, or to bravely bear, as one defines it, to persevere against this temptation. We walk in the Spirit. Galatians 5:16 tells us, if we do that, we shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. If you walk in the Spirit, walking after the word of the Spirit, you shall not, the Bible tells us, the Bible promises us, you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. So if you follow the Spirit's direction by the Spirit's word, singing psalms and being thankful in your heart, which is the mark of one who is walking or filled with the Spirit of God, you shall not fulfill those lusts of the flesh. If we are obedient children, as Peter says, not fashion ourselves according to the form of lust and ignorance. If we are childlike in our following and our faith of Christ, of those heinous sins, which of ingratitude and murmuring and lustfulness and covetousness, we can put those off. Israel was an ungrateful child. They were not grateful to God for His blessings. They were not thankful for the manna. They were not thankful for deliverance. But God had given them a bounty and a feast and a blessing. And they crossed their arms and they stomped their little feet. And they started crying and whining like a spoiled child. And that lust and that murmuring brought the judgment upon them. You know, that's one thing, probably universal, that no one likes to see in somebody else's child is a child that is ungrateful and disrespectful. You know, if we see a child at the store fall on the ground, start kicking his feet and crying over a lollipop or a piece of candy or something, you know, we'll in the back of our mind say, boy, what a spoiled little child that kid is. But it's hard for us to see it in ourselves. It's hard for us to see it whenever we pray and we want something so bad that life just won't be worth living unless God gives it to us, and God tells us no. And then in our souls, we fall to the ground, start kicking and screaming and crying, and say, I want it, I want it, I want it. I'm not going to be happy till I get it. That's the mark of an ungrateful child. And that's the way Israel is, and Paul warns us in 1 Corinthians 10 not to do that, not to be like that. Sometimes we have to step away from ourselves and honestly consider how we're acting and just say, you know, say to ourselves, am I being an ungrateful child? Am I acting like a child of God ought to act? Do I have an obedient spirit to my Lord and Master in His providence for my life? Well, this grave of lust, we need to be on the lookout for. You might be just on an ordinary day. You wake up and you're just doing what you normally do on a Thursday tomorrow. You might just have a normal Thursday. But the devil may have something for you tomorrow to cause you to lust. He may subtly bring something to your mind tomorrow, to your attention tomorrow, to tempt you into this covetousness attitude. Be on guard. Be on guard. Be on guard as you walk, and you not fall into these graves of lust. Israel did this for your example. So heed the warning and follow the example. Take the light of the Word of God to shine on your path and bury your lust, and not let your lust bury you. So let's close with a word of prayer.